It's August of 1962, and a series of recorded interviews are taking place as a film director prepares to finish his adaptation of The Birds. And when asked what his method for adapting the novel was, he responded with, "What I do is to read a story only once, and if I like the basic idea, I just forget all about the book and start to create cinema." This quote is, of course, from Alfred Hitchcock during his interviews with Francis Truffaut, a French filmmaker and film theorist, who, through his study of Hitchcock's films, pioneered the concept that would later become the Auteur theory. And what this quote suggests is that whilst faithfulness to an author's original vision may seem important, for an author, that process of turning the literal into the visual involves a different step, which is to implement their own vision into the story. For Hitchcock, his approach was to gain the rights to relatively unknown books and, without the author's input, turn them into his idea of cinema. Now, this approach may seem quite radical, but as Hutchins states, the act of adaptation always involves both reinterpretation and then recreation, and it's this statement that supports two fundamental parts of the Auteur theory: distinguishable personality and interior meaning, or in other words, how an auteur's filmmaking style and personal philosophies influence their work, especially when it comes to adaptations. And so it's through this lens that we will compare and contrast two films from two different auteurs to see how their unique filmmaking styles and personal philosophies influence their adaptations of the same novel, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Ever since its publication in 1847, Bronte's bleak vision for Wuthering Heights has become a key trademark that, when translated to the screen, always becomes visually compelling. However, whilst the essence of her vision can still be felt within these two adaptations, the creative juxtaposition between Emerald Fennell and Andrea Arnold's filmmaking styles remains. But how is this the case? Well, Sarris's auteur theory argues that, to be an auteur, a director must exhibit certain recurrent characteristics of style which serve as their signature. Therefore, Sarris suggests that no matter the story, if a director is an auteur, then their creative footprint can be found within any project they've done. And this is especially the case for Andrea Arnold, whose adaptation distances itself from the novel's Gothic roots in favour of a more naturalistic approach, which, as Buechler states, has stripped away the supernatural components of Bronte's novel to emphasise the social realism already present in her previous works like Wasp, Red Road and Fish Tank. In these films, she established herself as a filmmaker that strives for authenticity, which in Wuthering Heights is most apparent in her depiction of the Yorkshire Dales, as her preference for handheld camera work, sensual B-roll and ambient sound designs offer a grounded portrayal that puts the environment's beauty and psychological power at the forefront of the story, with the director even stating that nature had to be a part of My Wuthering Heights. However, where Arnold's adaptation embraces nature and realism, Fennell completely contrasts it with a highly stylized interpretation that is unapologetically provocative. And whilst this style is quite tame in her debut film, it dominates Saltburn's visual aesthetic, as Fennell's use of rich colour palettes and striking imagery accentuates the eccentric lifestyle of its characters, and provides the film with a signature Gothic look that she has once again utilised in Wuthering Heights. However, this is no coincidence, as the director even defines herself as a Gothic witch at heart. Therefore, we can see how her fascination with the Gothic bleeds into her artistic use of cinematography and production design, as they combine to create a strong visual composition of the story, capturing both its glamour and cruelty in the same frame. With that said though, the visual language of Wuthering Heights isn't the only trait of Bronte's vision that these two auteurs alter, as we will come to see how they redesign the book's plot to suit their philosophies. The tale of Wuthering Heights is an emotionally driven memoir told from the perspective of Nellie Dean, who recounts her experience of Cathy and Heathcliff's destructive love affair. And whilst the core of this story remains in these two films, both directors diminish Bronte's unreliable narrator in favour of sharing their interpretations of Cathy and Heathcliff's discreet relationship. But how does this relate to their interior meaning? Well, as Sarris states, interior meaning is the tension between a director's personality and their material. Therefore, this notion suggests that if an auteur has a strong personality and/or personal beliefs, then they can be found within any story they direct, and this is most certainly the case with Emerald Fennell, as in 2019 she expressed her belief that all obsession is sexual to some degree, And so, as the relationships in Bronte's novel are also built on obsession, we can see where Fennell got this interpretation of the story from.
Daphne du Maurier called it a kind of completely sexless book, and I profoundly disagree. I believe, there's so much in the book that feels dangerously sexual.
These moments of sexual obsession she's referring to are most apparent in how she recreates Heathcliff's cruelty, as it's his obsession with Cathy that destroys Edgar's marriage to her, degrades Isabella into his sexual slave, and is the reason for Cathy's death at the end of the film. However, where Fennell's adaptation interprets obsession as the cause for Heathcliff's cruelty, Arnold gives us an alternative answer.
I got very obsessed with Heathcliff when I read it again about his childhood and how brutally he's treated. And I guess you can say that's a theme in a lot of my work, is that if you treat someone brutally when they're small, how do you think they're going to turn out when they're big?
What this quote from Arnold refers to is a depiction of Heathcliff as a black man, which whilst being a cinematic first, is ironically not a deviation from Bronte's novel, as Heathcliff's race is the cause for most of the abuse that he is subjected to, and therefore, as Arnold's philosophy centres around using film to represent the marginalised in society, we can see why the theme of race is at the heart of her adaptation. But unlike Bronte's story, we never leave Heathcliff's side, which makes every hit and racial slur that much more painful, but not the most painful part, as when Cathy says, "It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff." The degradation doesn't come from his destitution, like in Fennell's film, but rather from the one thing he can't control, his race, and therefore, Arnold's adaptation shows us that Heathcliff's cruelty may not be a part of his nature, but rather the result of society's racial injustice. So, after comparing and contrasting Emerald Fennell's and Andrea Arnold's adaptations of Wuthering Heights, we can see that they both support Hutchins' theory on adaptation, as when an author adapts a novel, they aren't just altered, but recreated in order to tell a new story. So, the next time you watch an author's adaptation, watch out for the differences, because the amount you'll see might just surprise you.